Welcome to Archispeak, the podcast that talks about what it's like to work in the profession of architecture. All right, so the idea with this show came from the last episode when we did our chat about the Netflix documentary on Ólafur Eliasson. And in that episode, we didn't speak about. He talked about Harpa, which is Ólafur has ventured into architecture, obviously seems to be well-trained to do so.
Yeah.
And he walked us through some of the work that they did on Harpa, which is, I don't know exactly the function of the building. I think it's kind of a conference center slash music hall. Yeah. And because I went into it, but we didn't get to go into the main space. I think that's often the case when you go visit places like these. Like I've been to Sydney Opera House and you just, it's under restoration, so you can't do it at that time. And so there's just things like that, and you got to pay money to go on these tours, and which I'm not opposed to, but we just didn't have the opportunity to get into the main space. But we did get to walk through, obviously, the gift shop. That's always it's always open.
Yes,
and
enter through the gift shop.
And yeah, enter and exit through the gift shop. And then there's the main kind of pre-function area and a couple of other really neat views of the harbor and stuff. And you do really get to experience architecturally, one of the most interesting things about that building is the facade and how it is very structural, and it is very much based on some geological areas in Iceland, right? Mm-hmm. Where he talked about that in the episode. And so it just made me think about how during the time that we're in right now, where we can't go experience architecture, how fundamentally important that is to the development of architects. And most people don't experience capital A architecture very often. If they do, sometimes it's just through magazines or through the screen on the computer. And so we thought it would be fun to talk about actually experiencing capital A architecture and kind of nerding out on it, right? Like that should be something that this show is all about.
I wanted to do a little bit more research because didn't he say it was the Ólafur? Didn't he say that one of the inspirations for his idea was basaltic formations?
Yeah. Yep.
And those look a lot like the western coast of Ireland. Basically, there's this huge formation that looks exactly the same as that. And I'm also the geography nerd as well. And, I always have been thinking a lot more of Pangea, and you start to take a look at the map and you start to see where geographically things look like they fit together perfectly well, or enough where you say, okay, well, maybe through erosion in time, what used to fit perfectly together now is just a slight variation thereof. But, I'm curious if there's, and this is just a complete side thought, but curious if there's any relationship to say Iceland and Ireland in the way that they connected based off of this formation. And where maybe it doesn't necessarily occur on east coast of Iceland and west coast of Ireland to really connect. But, it's just, that was my side thought as I'm sitting there watching. I'm like, that looks a lot like, this. And
I pointed at it and my kids were there and I said, what does that look like? And they said, oh, Devil's Postpile, which we had been to, which is up in Mammoth in Central California, kind of eastern Sierras. And very similar, again, formations. It's really geometric like that. And the idea is that, there's the molten hot lava and there's air coming up through it and water coming up through it, and it's boiling, and it these columns of stuff trying to get out are densifying against each other. And so they're pushing against each other, kind of like a friction pile. And that's what's causing these flat sides, is because there's so much pressure and they're pushing against each other that it creates these really interesting 5, 6, 7-sided columns that then harden like that. And what's cool about Devil's Postpile is then a glacier came through and smoothed the top off. And so at the top, you've got these perfect geometric tiles. It's like a dance floor on the top of this thing. The way you approach it is you hike from the bottom up, and you get to look at this wall of geometric columns that are, a lot of them have fallen off, but there's still a lot, in their vertical orientation. It looks like a rock climbing kind of a dream. And then you get to the top and it's polished, and it's such a contrast to what you see down below that it's really interesting. So, I mean, bringing that back to architecture and kind of fusing an idea like that you find in nature and kind of using this geologic or biophilic inspiration to create the facade of that building, I thought was really interesting. And what's cool about it in Harpa is that it's glass and steel tubes, and you can actually inhabit the space of the space frame, which is super cool. So big picture, this episode, I think for us is more about maybe coming up with the significant list of buildings that we've been to in the past, let's say up to 3 or 4 years, and then go through that list and come down with a short list. And then on the next episode, we will have picked one to talk about each that we think is like really significant, worth talking about. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right. So my list, as we were holding there before the episode started, I actually found a couple more things I wanted to add to it. So I think I'm up to 32 or 33 on my list. They're so good. So I do get to travel some. So
yeah,
I'm not complaining.
Well, so here let's talk about how our list forms. So
yeah,
some of mine are both obviously places that I've been and experience, and then others are places that I have on my bucket list or my just wish list of places that I'd like to go that haven't gone, that I've been to, maybe a place or two from this particular architect, and I'm like, oh, they also did this, and I really would love to see that. But, a lot of mine, a lot of our travel is, in the car with family and things like that. Mm-hmm. And as I kind of experienced, even yesterday when we were driving around, trying to find a place that, was not as crowded with, now that everybody's slowly but surely allowed to, get out and at least, hit the hiking trails and things like that. So we always drive past, like these amazing early 1700, mid 1700 type buildings that are still existing, or, there's foundations of, and I always stop, and my wife's like, really again? And so a lot of times I have to drive past things because I always get that, really, we're stopping again. So it always goes on my list of I really want to go back and, take a look at that. And so that's more of where my list is. Where is yours?
How often does that actually happen? Do you actually get to go back?
Surprisingly enough, in some of these cases we do. And there are some really, my wife loves looking at architecture and stuff, but, a lot of times the trip from, the house to wherever we're going is usually a long trip, and she doesn't want to sit in the truck for however long she needs to. And so anytime or every time I pull the car off the side of the road, the kids are, say, I get to stretch my legs, but also, I get to check out this weird little thing that for some reason has captivated my dad. And so, we get to do things like that, but she's just like, really?
Well, my wife is trained as an architect and feels the same way.
Dude, you're stopping again?
Yeah. If we can find a place that's kind of a really great balance of architecture and nature, those are the best for both of us.
Yeah, so we get the good architecture and nature, and then thankfully she's a history nerd, so if it's historical, then she's all for it. And so, there are going to be some of those that on my list that are more district oriented, that are also historic oriented.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm thinking through right now, and the two that kind of stand out to me that her and I had been to together that were really great. So I'll start my list off with these. Is most recently the Portland Japanese Gardens, which I think that was Kengo Kuma, if I'm not mistaken, and I wasn't expecting it. So, and I haven't gone back to do much research, but when we were in Portland, that was one of the places that was recommended to go to. And a lot of times, we go somewhere and we intentionally don't do a bunch of research ahead of time, so that we can just go experience the place and kind of ask other people what's worth seeing. So when we were up there, we did like Multnomah Falls, and we went down to the Big Pink, and we did, some hikes up in the castles, and there's all kinds of neat stuff there. We had great weather. But the number one thing by far was the Portland Japanese Gardens. And again, having no idea what we were getting ourselves into, like, we love visiting gardens. There's a few great gardens around us here, and obviously, Longwood Gardens that we've been to in Pennsylvania. Yes. You and I have been there together. It's just, we love that kind of stuff. And so the Portland one is amazing. It's up on this hillside. And then there's the visitor center building, which is, from what I understand, relatively new. It looks like brand new. It's beautiful. And that was just one of those great places of balance for the both of us. And that was one that was definitely on my list. It definitely checks the box of capital A architecture, even though it's not trying to stand out. It's a very understated, beautifully detailed design. What Cormac and I did for this episode was we both shared a photo album with each other. So if you look in there, you'll see a picture of a steel roof. You can just see these giant plates of steel that are held off of each other by a couple inches each, and the roof is planted in kind of these natural gutters, and there's these little, the plants are growing over the edge of the roof, and it's just this gorgeous play of steel, glass, and wood in a beautiful setting. And then the gardens are just amazing. So the other one that we visited that is very similar but not is in Sweden. We went to, and I'm going to try to say the name properly here, Skogskyrkogården, and that is a cemetery. It's called the Woodland Cemetery in Sweden, and you should definitely look it up because it was designed by 2 architects. And one of those architects was Gunnar Asplund. And that's what I was looking up as we kind of were just getting ready to record, because a friend of the show actually recommended that I go see this. And I had no idea that it existed. We were in Stockholm. We got on the train. We went up here, and it's an enormous, like, it's not just a tiny cemetery. And my wife and I actually do like to go walk around really old, cool cemeteries. We try to do it all over the place. But Greta Garbo is buried in this one, for instance, which is kind of weird. All of a sudden, you just stumble upon this ordained gravestone, and it's Greta Garbo. But the planning of the cemetery, the way the buildings are placed, there's several buildings on it, and the idea of the kind of these chapels that form some really interesting complexes, and the way that the buildings don't touch each other was one of the things that was really kind of pointed out as one of the neat architectural moves, and it's handled in different ways depending on which chapel you're looking at. But amazing place, balancing kind of architecture and nature, and in this case a cemetery, but it's acres and acres and acres, and you just go walk. You walk the woods. It really is a woodland cemetery. It's pretty amazing. So that's another one on probably worth putting on the short list of ones worth talking about in the future. So what about you?
Well,
start us off with a couple ideas here.
So there is one, and this is on the need to see list, and the reason why it's need to see, and it's a local one, but unfortunately didn't get a chance to see it because it opened up recently in September of last year, and because the events were sold out so quickly and with security and everything else, it became too, in a way, it became a little too cumbersome to actually try to get out there. And that is the Reach Center at the Kennedy Center. And it is a new construction, and I'm trying to, I believe it was Stephen Hull who did it. But it's these beautiful little pavilions that, create this nice little landscape that in otherwise like a very urban context, you don't actually have like these very framed views of the space. And so there are these just beautifully thin curving walls. And I don't know if you've seen any images of the Reach Center.
I probably have. I think I have. Yeah.
But it's basically a massive green roof with the top of all of these little pavilions kind of popping out of it, and then helping define the space of this big green roof. And it's pretty amazing space. And, and unfortunately, just like I said, at the time it opened, I mean, I don't know if they realize this, but I couldn't go because I've got a deadline, man. And so
how come they didn't confirm with you first?
Didn't confirm that, I was, but I guess what it is that it's this interesting like evolution of modern architecture within DC that, you've got like this very mid-century modern Kennedy Center. It caps a road that's immediately underneath it that, as you're driving in from my neck of the woods, like Georgetown and, the Maryland suburbs, right over the DC border. And as you kind of come into it, it helps frame this view of DC, where as you like go underneath the road and you're going underneath the Kennedy Center, then kind of like the whole monuments start to open up and all this other stuff. So it's this beautiful picturing, like just the old Kennedy Center was great in doing that. But then, now you see these like, beautiful, like very delicate buildings kind of pop up, and there's nothing super articulated about them, mostly just these beautifully stone clad, delicate kind of sweeps. But it's a beautiful building. And unfortunately, that's one of those ones that's in the I need to see list. But since it's really local to me, I'll be able to like, come back maybe next episode or episode later and kind of report on, what I've seen there and how, what the experience is. Obviously aren't going to be going back, going into the building for quite some time, because you and I were talking, earlier. It's like, when you start clicking on doing a little bit of research on some of these buildings that we've been to, almost every one of them say temporarily closed, which is the next one that I have on my list, which is one that I have been to. And I think people might be getting a little like tired of me saying it over and over and over again, as an example of a building that they need to see. But it's another local building to me, and it's the Glenstone Museum. Another one that is very reliant on the landscape, and, it helps basically, it's the whole museum experience is a series of dotting this nice landscape in Potomac, Maryland, 12 minutes away from my house. And, we go there often, but it's another just absolutely beautiful one by, Thomas Pfeiffer. And that's another one where, when you experience, this particular building, you see the work that Thomas Pfeiffer did, you start to think about, I want to, start to go see some other ones. And especially when we were looking at the Olafur thing, you start to see these buildings that, just these like very native to the place buildings, for Iceland or Denmark or wherever that, he's been just a part of. He's obviously not the architect of it, but he's at least been a part of it. And you just look at me like, and, I think what's interesting about those, and probably like 90% of our list is the contextual element of it.
It's interesting that the four buildings that we started with are not, they're more like a complex than a building. And they're more like breaking down the scale of a larger scope of area. I mean, especially the reach that you're talking about at the Kennedy Center it's completely different than the old Kennedy Center, right? Which was one giant mid-century modern building.
Big building.
and kind of like Glenstone, the reach very similarly frames a bunch of interesting views and really plays with the landscape. And to me, like this kind of really experiential landscape, it's not on my list because I haven't been there in a long time, but like the Getty Center out here is like that too, where it's this giant complex of broken down components that you start to weave between and up and down. And even the old Getty out here is very similar to that, which has a beautiful new addition to it. New is in air quotes. It's probably 10 years old, but is architecturally I guess that's new. But it's interesting to kind of think about how these really successful projects that we've experienced are bigger than themselves, right? They reach out into the landscape, they successfully weave the landscape in, and it talks to me about how important that is as an element of capital A architecture when it's about the entire experience from arrival to departure. It's not just about once you walk through the door necessarily. So that's kind of an interesting little take on that.
So what's funny is like actually one of my other entries on the list is not a specific piece of architecture, but it's a collection of buildings and landscape that form the place. And, it's Cranbrook. And Cranbrook itself, it's an art institute, and it's a beautiful place of, like very, very creative places. But because of the way that they put the buildings together and the way that they created like these little small spaces and these very large open spaces that, you kind of, it almost caters to almost every kind of personality type. It's the introvert, it's the extrovert, it's like the social person, it's the solitary person, it's different ways of thinking about how you create. And like the way that they arrange these buildings and arrange these little small courtyards and these overlapping, now, like different intersections of the corridors and the passages and just like these interesting little found spaces that, the I'm going to use it now, interlapping of all of these different spaces has now, created. It's just, because, you've got some really beautiful mid-century modern buildings. You've got some really beautiful Art Nouveau type buildings. You've got like an interesting canvas of different like Saarinen type from mid-career to early career from the son, and then, late career of the father. And, so you've got the opportunity for all of those different ones. And it's just the way that the buildings have been pulled together. It isn't just one specific building on this campus. It is the whole campus and how it reacts to each building. And so that, to me, is one of the things that makes it more successful. What's interesting about it is, in context, you're driving around just a suburban neighborhood in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and it's a nice neighborhood. But you see like this tree-lined streets, and on one side it's these houses, and on the other side it's a beautifully articulated brick fence, and the brick fence is the walls of the school, and it blends beautifully into the neighborhood. But, then once you get past the gates into the campus, it's just this completely different oasis that obviously transports you from suburbia on one side of the fence to this just beautifully interlocking campus of buildings and landscape, and, how each of the interweaving of those spaces creates something really special in each of those spaces. Every time we visit family in Michigan, and specifically when I go and, visit my father, it's on the way from where we usually stay with family to go up and visit him. And then as we're coming home, we, have that opportunity to just basically stop. And usually it's a thing that just my daughter and I do, is we just stop there, probably grab like a hot chocolate and, just walk the campus. And it's just an amazing little place.
I would love to go there. I've seen so many great things about it, but I've never actually stepped foot in Michigan. So that would definitely be on my bucket list of places.
The interesting thing about Michigan, it's not one specific place, like one specific building, because there's a lot of like really, really nice mid-century modern buildings. And even now, more contemporary buildings, now that there's a lot of, like in the more recent years, some of, the economy starting to strengthen up, and they're starting to, really build some really nice work there. I'm really eager to watch the progress of the building that Shop is doing in downtown Detroit, which is the replacement for the old Hudson building where my parents subsequently they met each other. They were both working there. I can't really remember where my mother, I think she was working in the restaurant. My father was working at the camera counter. So I'm very interested in what the replacement building is going to be. And so, that's one that I'm going to, continue to track and put on a later list. But there's just these, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Midland, Michigan, which unfortunately has been in the news because of the failure of the dam that flooded this beautiful mid-century modern town that has just got all these amazing gems of buildings. There's this, I blanked on his name, but it was one of the students and disciples of Frank Lloyd Wright had moved there and had started building. And so, you see these very Wrightian type buildings all over the place, and it's just this absolutely gorgeous place. I probably need to do a much better job of trying to find the one specific buildings in there. I mean, Minoru Yamasaki, he practiced out of Detroit, and so the architect of the original, for those who aren't familiar with, the architect of the original Twin Towers practiced out of Detroit, and the interesting fenestration of the Twin Towers and kind of these really long vertical windows that kind of pinched at varying locations and stuff and kind of pinched in to kind of form a point. That was something that if you drive around Detroit, in the suburbs of Detroit, you will see Yamasaki buildings all over the place that have that very, very Yamasaki language that, my wife even told me, and she showed it to me before it got demoed. It was called the Quo Vadis, but it was this very quirky looking movie theater that he had designed. And sure enough, if you look at it, you're like, that looks like the same fenestration as the Twin Towers.
Yeah. It's like a tuning fork.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He kept testing it over and over and over again.
Right.
And then somebody gave him the opportunity to build it on a really big scale. And sure enough, he did.
Okay, so I'm going to go away from let's call this the not architecture category, but still kind of worthy of the list. So I have a couple of ones that I've been to recently that I think are just worth consideration, but aren't necessarily going to make it to the final. So the first one is recent trip last year to New York, got to experience the Vessel. So I would say that probably falls into this category, right? It's kind of architecture, ? Kind of not. Right, it's not indoors; it's outdoors, and it's a billionaires playground over there. So there's other considerations, probably discussions worth having about that kind of social responsibility and things like of that nature. But I think also kind of firmly on that list would be I went to the Sundial Bridge by Calatrava up in Northern California. And it's one of those things where you drag the family out there and then it's like, wow, this is pretty cool. It actually encourages interaction with the bridge, and it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. And again, not architecture, but architectural for sure.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of times with both of those, they were done by architects, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Heatherwick is probably not licensed, but
well, not licensed. I mean,
but worked with architect. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I mean, his name is all over the place and multiple buildings and stuff like that. And, and then Calatrava.
Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't licensed either. So,
well, yeah. But, it's interesting because, they're habitable. They embody a lot of the purpose and mission of architecture. And, they aren't really necessarily performing shelter or providing shelter, but they are performing a experiential thing. And so, is everything, you talked about cemeteries and stuff, and there are some very architectural cemeteries out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Scarpa, yeah.
Exactly, And so are they necessarily, and this is a question for everybody, and they're probably sitting there, yelling one opinion or another right now, but does architecture have to be shelter? Pure, enclosed four walls in a roof?
And I'm firmly on the side of it does not, because I honestly believe that architects should be involved in a lot more of just the built environment in general, right? How many freeway underpasses and overpasses and how many parks and how should have been designed by architects? There's so much opportunity out there that we've just given up on or haven't been included, or there's a myriad of reasons, but it's I totally agree with what you're saying, and that's why they're on my list, is because they give that sense of place, or they have the opportunity to give that sense of place, and they're not enclosure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'll add one more to the list, which was one of the more recent ones, and I think you and your son went there too, separate from me, but Hoover Dam was very architectural, but definitely not architecture, right? Capital A architecture, but what an experience. What an amazing thing that was created. And it was great to go on the tour and get in there and actually experience it and hear about all the thought that went into it and the things that they've done since 1930s to make it more of an experience for people and to really talk about kind of the engineering marvel that it is, but then some of the bigger ideas about it and how it was done, I think are definitely make it listable in this episode.
Well, you actually bring up an interesting one when you talk about the Hoover Dam and I know that Hoover Dam isn't necessarily one, but the National Park Service has got absolutely beautiful collection of some of the most amazing buildings that I have ever seen. One of them that I always lament the loss of, but always
the Neutra building.
The Neutra building at Gettysburg, was the cyclorama, and I understand, they're in the reason why they removed the building because they wanted to restore the actual battlefield to, the pristine condition of, what it was on the day that the battle happened. However, that building captured absolutely a view of the battlefield that just standing on the grass and looking one way or the other, you couldn't really see the full breadth of this battlefield. But then you go to the observation deck of the cyclorama and you are perched overhead at the ridge line, where you could oversee Pickett's charge, and you could see, you have this visual connection between where the Union's armies were and the Confederate armies were, and you can see this whole thing and fully understand like the magnitude of the space that, you sort of get it a little bit when you're standing at like the tree lines and things like that where the Union soldiers were, but you don't really get to see the full interconnectedness of everything by just kind of standing in this one part. But this building created such a unique perspective that it was, a lot of people hated it because it was a very modern building. Obviously it was Neutra. And so, unfortunately, they built a new cyclorama. They moved everything over to the new building, which is a very rustic kind of building, more kind of in keeping with like the farms and the farmhouses and all that other stuff in the area. And this Neutra building was very much different from everything else. But it was just, it kind of served this purpose. And, you think about like the building, and I could literally litter half of my list with buildings from the national parks, and just the way that they create and capture these views that you would otherwise never get because, one, the building is in the way, but two, it's just they went out of their way to kind of like build these things, the beautiful buildings in Grand Tetons, and there's just all these different national park ones. I mean, that right there alone would be an interesting one to talk about because of its interconnectedness to like the CCC and, like this whole kind of like, let's let everybody see America kind of thing and create in the creation of the, I think somebody calls it like the parkitecture.
There's so many good ones. I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, ones that I've been to in the last few years. There's an amazingly beautiful small visitor center at the south side of Canyonlands National Park. It's called the Needles Visitor Center. There's the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite. There's the Bowen Chawinski Jackson Visitor Center at the Grand Tetons.
Yes.
There's the Old Faithful Lodge in Yellowstone. Like, there's so many great examples.
That big lodge is the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, it's so amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. That is like that might be another episode worth right there. Just so much good stuff there. And again, I think like park visitors kind of take it for granted, but when an architect walks into these and you start staring at the details of in some cases it's like the grand scale of the Ahwahnee and the stone and the timber or the Old Faithful Lodge, and then sometimes it's the incredible detailing of like the Needles Visitor Center or the stainless steel strips embedded in the concrete at the Grand Tetons Visitor Center. So it's just things, there's so many different things to think about and look at when you get to these. And it is amazing to see the Park Service kind of invest in these amazing architectural experiences to go along with the amazing natural experiences that people are having there. That's really cool. So there was one more here that I thought is kind of bridging the gap between object and experience, which was the St. Louis Arch. Which is just, it's an amazing experience. And I went a couple of years ago, after the new visitor center had opened, and the kind of subterranean, you push down, you go through this really fantastic circular opening that you kind of depresses down into the ground, and it takes you through this really great procession about, expansion to the west, and, the whole idea behind the competition for the arch and it becoming this gateway to the west. And you go through this historical lesson until you get to right before you go up into the arch, and you get to see like the actual outcome of the design competition. You get to see the models that were built by Saarinen's office, and then to go up in that rickety ass old elevator. Super cool experience, kind of claustrophobic for a lot of people. And then you go up to the top, and you just get this amazing view out these tiny little windows. And again, like worthy of consideration for the list, because what an experience, and what a monument to what architecture and structural engineering can be. And then with the addition of this whole underground kind of procession to get there, I think is really successful. And some of my favorite photographs that I've taken in the last few years came out of this place. So it's definitely worthy of the list.
Which is funny because it's on my list as well.
Nice.
But I even expanded it a little bit. When the interstate came through and cut through, it basically cut a big, huge scar through downtown, where downtown was never connected to the arch. And so it was really hard for people to get to the arch. So a lot of times the arch sort of fell in disrepair.
Just got skipped.
It just got skipped. I mean, it was more of a challenge to get there and be a part of downtown, because there's a lot of really cool buildings in downtown. There's this beautiful, Sullivan building, within walking distance of the arch. But if you were standing at the Sullivan building, you couldn't walk directly to the arch from there. But now you can. That whole effort, that project was probably one of the best things that St. Louis has done. Now, they could absolutely pull up that nasty carpet at the top of the arch.
Yeah.
And, because it smells musty and crappy up there. They could have at least done that, but, maybe it was,
it's a phased restoration.
I sure hope so, because you go through, and I love kind of like, as you're talking about when you're walking down into the arch, you almost have this like engraved cutout of the arch that's bowing towards the arch rather than bowing away from the arch, like like you would with a shadow line or something like that. And so
right.
it was kind of interesting that kind of helped create, it almost creates like a circle from, a nice little viewpoint far enough away from the arch where you can see the entry into the building, and you can kind of see the buildings carved in there. And the great thing about it is that the way that the building, both the Museum of Westward Expansion and the revitalized one, they're like so delicately placed there that you really don't see them. And the further and further you get away from, all you really see is just the arch and how it makes connection to the ground. And you don't really see all of these other buildings blocking the way in the view. But when you get there, you realize that this is a pretty massive undertaking to create that building underneath the arch. And then I always think about how the judging process went when people are like, oh, I've seen this type of a monument before. This is very interesting. It's very conventional. I can see how that could be constructed. And then they go down the list and they see all of these, and they're very like conventional things. And then they're like, what the, how can you do that? And then they were like, yeah, let's do that one. This
right.
Because I do.
It's a triumph. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, how could anyone be possessed to actually pick that one as a winner? And it's obvious. It's kind of like what we talked about in the last episode, where you were talking about Bjarke Ingels projects, where you have this giant absurd idea, that would actually work, but you had to have a studio and the freedom to come up with ideas like that.
Yeah.
To then later deem them as the obvious choice. And it is the obvious choice. Like thinking about it as a gateway and looking toward the future. I mean, this embodies that in so many different ways. It's also interesting to me, you talked about the entry and the way that it's oriented. Obviously, it's oriented as a collector from from downtown, right? Which is really important based on the stuff that you said right before that about connecting back to this, like reconnecting with the city. That's huge. And it really did kind of remind me of Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, right? Where it's like this cut in the earth, and it's so subtle yet so powerful.
Yeah.
Like just the entry to this. And what if I do have one kind of regret was that not knowing that this it's funny, this actually is a national park, right?
Yeah.
I didn't bring my park pass, so I had to pay to get in. but it's that important. It's achieved that status, and it's interesting to me that the national park actually runs that entire museum and everything.
Well, the only thing that you do have to pay for, a national park pass or not, you do have to pay for the actual like trip up into the arch,
right?
But
which is optional. You don't have to do that.
Yeah, but you can. Yeah, like I went in and I had my national parks pass. And I also was behind a family who just paid like $50-$60 to get in and do all the other stuff. And for me, it was like $8 to go up to the top and do all of the other things and stuff. So, I mean, it wasn't bad. Hell, it was great.
Yeah, definitely. So what else is on your list?
Well, one that I just recently visited just at the very, very beginning of coronavirus cases popping up in New York. I happened to be in New York, and there's a handful of like these buildings on my list in New York City, but one particularly was the New York Times building. And the thing that I just find most amazing about all of that is here you have this enormous skyscraper, but every single detail was thought of and exposed and, put on display. And you see this, this beautiful cross bracing, you have this exposed structural steel system. And, then everything's kind of like interlaid with all of this stuff. And then you've got these beautiful cross braces that are just, on turnbuckles, and the way that they did, turn the turnbuckle for one cross bracing to kind of go through the other one. But then you step back and you look at through the window, you see the stairs, and the stairs are at the perfect angle of all of the cross bracing. And, it's just that layering effect of just, oh, and then they thought of this. Oh, and then they thought of this. And so there's not like one thing that seems to be out of place, other than once you probably get into, somebody coming in and doing like a tenant fit out that isn't really in keeping with what the overall scheme of the building is. But for the few places that I had visited, and I visited, God, it seems like a decade ago, really, right when it opened up, Lutron was actually doing a tour. Yeah. They were doing a tour of it, for, their lighting and sun shading and all of that other stuff. And I was lucky enough to go on that tour, and because of where I was at, I got to take the train up and meet up with the group, and I paid for like a big, huge multi-course, Italian dinner and all this other stuff, and paid for my train back, which was just fantastic. That's one of the things I remember most about it, is this delightful dinner. But I mean, like,
treat yourself.
Yeah. I mean, but all of the details are just so well thought out. Now that's one that's like teetering on a contextual problem, only because the buildings that surround it are of equal scale, and some are of like, are nice buildings or nicer buildings. And then some are like, oh God, it's just like, but because of that, I think it also helps kind of like let that building stand apart on its own as like, on this block, there ain't anything better than that building. I mean, it's just such a beautifully articulated, just every little detail was thought through on that thing. And so, you have got to applaud Mr. Piano and his studio, because it is just gorgeously thought through.
Yeah, I've just walked by the base of it. I did have the opportunity to take a tour, but I was incapacitated, hungover, and I couldn't actually do anything. It was one of those Lutron trips. So let's keep it in New York. Do you have anything else on your list from New York?
So there are two buildings in New York that I've visited. Both of them I have high marks for the concept. One of them, as we've talked about in the past, it kind of like falls apart. But I feel like they're interconnected in a way, even though they're on like two separate sides of Manhattan Island, or one's in the middle and one's at, near in the end. And it is is it called the Oculus? Have I completely forgotten it? Yeah, the Oculus and
the Westfield Mall.
Yeah, the Westfield Mall. Let's be clear, that's the one that I am not the biggest fan of, and the Guggenheim Museum. And the reason I pull those two together, and you've seen that I've sent you these pictures before. When you walk into the Guggenheim Museum, there's this in-floor medallion right as you walk through the vestibule of the Guggenheim, where I swear to you, the designer of the Westfield Mall, aka the Oculus, must have walked in there and said, it's an interesting concept.
I like that.
Because the symbol in the medallion looks damn near exactly like the final product of the Oculus. And I
mean, elevation of it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I love the concept of both of them. It's just that one is another one, to me, going back to the New York Times building, to me, that one suffers from context because it seems so awkwardly placed and it almost feels shoehorned and jammed into things. And then you look deeper and deeper with a project manager's eye of like finishing of just all of the little things. Whereas you look at the New York Times building, and when I went through it, and I was with a couple of guys on my project team, and we were all looking at it both in awe, but we were also looking at it, is detailing in how did they detail this and how did they detail that. And I would say 99% of that building met the sniff test of like everything was beautifully detailed and thought through. There was a few things where like floors were coming together in a very awkward condition that, you're like, well, if you would have just done this, it, would be perfect. And of course, that's just happens when every single building that everybody ever goes to, is that architects can never find a perfect building because they always find some flaw somewhere.
Yeah, I was gonna say I pulled up a picture of the Guggenheim medallion that you're talking about. We'll put it in the show notes, and just so everybody knows, everything that we're talking about, we'll have links to it in the show notes so that you don't have to go search for it yourself. You can just click for a link.
Yeah,
but it is exactly. I mean, it's close.
Am I right?
Am I right or am I right? Well, the Guggenheim was on my list too. I think some of the favorite photos that I've taken that are architectural in the last few years came out of that building, and it was an amazing experience. And I definitely spent quite a bit of time there with a friend of the show, Brett Levitt, as well, and we took a lot of photos. But it was one of those days where the lighting was just perfect, and it's probably hard to find a day when it's not. Yeah. The way that the building is designed is to get the lighting in there the way that it does, and going up to the top and then spiraling your way down and then ending up in the restaurant and looking at all the details and the way the columns touch the floor and the way that the sculpted lenses of windows in different places around the restaurant and the entry are kind of, it was definitely the circle template phase of Frank Lloyd Wright, right?
Yeah.
But it was nice. It is an amazing experience, and I got some amazing photos, and it was one of those places that really is capital A architecture to me. So I think this one is definitely worthy of being on the short list of ones that we might talk about in the next episode and do a deeper dive. We'll see.
Yeah, well, I believe that particular trip that you're talking about, if you guys would have held off one more day, I could have joined you on that trip. But for some reason, y'all just wanted to go ahead and start having your architectural tour fun without me and couldn't wait.
This was like my third trip to New York, and every other time I'd been to New York, the Guggenheim was covered with scaffolding because they were repairing the plaster. And it's like, I've been waiting for 2 decades to get into this building. Cormac, I was not going to wait one more day.
Nice. Appreciate that.
All right. So anything else in New York? I got one if you don't.
I mean, go for it.
This goes back to kind of what we started off by talking about. You'll see why here in a second. Any guesses with that little hint? All right, I'll spare you. It's the High Line.
I was gonna ask if it was the High Line, but
we've been there together.
Right. But it's one of those ones that she's like, well, you could say the High Line because there was so much that was done to it. Obviously, as everybody knows, it was elevated train tracks that were abandoned and repurposed. But I think the thing about that, the power of that one, is how it interweaves. And I'm gonna let you keep talking before I ramble on about it, but it's that interweaving and connecting so many other beautiful buildings. So it's not just one thing about that High Line because it connects, we walk the whole thing. We started from the convention center all the way to the very end of it, where when you go down the stairs at the very end, doesn't it, there's like a little installation that when you look up, it says, give your daughters strange names or something like that.
Interesting names, yeah. I think. Yeah, something like that.
And I was like, of course, I did. But anyway, it was just, it's this beautiful interweaving of this landscape intervention, built landscape intervention with all of these beautiful architectural, all these architectural buildings that it interweaves between and how they respond to it as well.
Yeah, this is one of those things where this is my favorite kind of architecture. And I don't know that you can really categorize it, but you know it when you see it, which is it's a repurposing of the old with new ideas kind of interwoven into it. And, I love going into old buildings that have heavy timber and big steel connections, and they're very industrial in that way, and they're very pure and raw. There's lots of buildings in Portland like that. There's lots of buildings in old cities that are like that. Like in Denver, where the REI headquarters is an old, I think it's an old coal mining plant that they've turned into this giant REI. And it's an amazingly cool thing because they've taken something that was like a very hard set of constraints and turned it into a complete transformation. Like that's what the High Line is. It's a complete transformation. And they did it at a time in the city when it was a blight, right? It was terrible. And they've turned it into the most activating thing that could possibly have happened to that side of Manhattan.
Well, yeah.
And it's so successful in that way, the way it goes from the Whitney and it becomes this experience all the way to Hudson Yards.
Right.
That's what's amazing to me about it is, and the wide-ranging experiences that you can have along the way that are, there's sitting, there's standing, there's grass, there's gardens, there's amphitheaters, there's lounge chairs, the way that they've interwoven the tracks and kind of the railroad language into the design of the hardscape and the softscape. And like, there's just so many things. There's so many things to look at. Every time you go, you will find something different to look at. And the way that they've planted it, and they've undulated the walking surface, taken advantage of a lot of different really weird constraints, right, and turn those into opportunities.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most successful things about it. And again, it's not architecture per se. It links a bunch of architecture, but it really is kind of this architectural monument that runs through the city that was originally designed by train engineers, right? And now it's this experience. And I think that, again, like that's what takes this back to really being successful capital A architecture is experience, like the way that it ties these things together and creates an experience for people. And what's so great about it is you see people who are tourists who go walk the whole thing. You see athletes who are jogging and running the whole thing. You see people who are just sitting, playing, having a picnic lunch. You see people who come out of the buildings at lunch and just use it and then go back out. There's so many different uses that are happening at the same time. It really does seem to activate it in a way that nothing else could.
It's also like a time clock too, because you're talking about how people come out and use it at various times of the day and stuff. And I remember that when we started, we kind of started midday. This was a family trip that I took, and as we were getting closer and closer to sunset, we were aligning ourselves with these roads that you could get this beautiful shot of like the sunset kind of cutting through this very glassy corridor, illuminating all of the buildings that framed out this view. But you're sitting there just staring at this like beautiful little like sunset view that, because of the perspective you're given from the High Line, you completely see it in a completely different way than you would if you were like standing on the ground or you're up. You might not get the same perspective, but this like lit corridor of like just golden light that's coming through that you're only really seeing from that perspective in the High Line. You walk a little bit further up the High Line, you don't get that view. You walk a little bit further down that High Line, you don't get that view. And there are some where there were very conscious decisions of the framing view, and then there's some that were just like these accidental finds that it's like, oh, in maybe like, because there are some like there's planting along, one of the ones that we found to be the most intriguing view that they didn't really think about that as being a view until after like some of these other buildings had infilled, and now they're like, hopefully maybe they come later on, and how they build off like these little like almost like amphitheater like pull-offs that they had, with like stacked seating and everything else. They hopefully they come and like add some of those, because they're just some of these great little opportunities, and absolutely love that.
Yeah, I can imagine, or I can't imagine, because it's got to be so much work, the investigation that had to happen for this. And, I know they've written books about this, and they've published all kinds of interesting things about it. But the amount of, I wonder how much of it was like kind of serendipitous versus discovered and planned for. I'm sure it's a good mix of both. And it is interesting the way that, it gets people off the street and it gets them up into different vantage point than they get of the city. And it is so attractive. That's what's really interesting to me about it. And it's not architecture, right? Because it's not, people aren't going into space, but it is very architectural. And I don't think that it kind of has to be on this list.
Back to what we were talking about on these, spaces that are occupied, but not like, enclosed spaces being architecture. Because each of these, it is so varying as you walk through the High Line of all of these different outdoor rooms that are created by the way that it like meanders underneath a building or around a building or in between buildings and things like that, these are well thought out, whether it's landscape architecture or capital A architecture. I feel it's very much architecture.
Yeah. So that's pretty much my New York list. I'd jump back to the West here and say one of the ones worthy of consideration is that I've been to a couple times in the last few years is Taliesin West.
Yes.
So kind of getting back to the complex and the way that Wright interwove, buildings and nature in a very, at the time, desolate, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, Taliesin West has been in the news in the last 6 months, closing down the architecture school and then maybe not. And, there's all kinds of weird political stuff going on there. But I've done the tour 2 times. I've been there 3 or 4 times. And it's one of those places where the last time was the first time I've ever taken my kids there. And for them to see it and experience it was really fun and really cool, because it's not like anything else. It's so different. And yet, the kids are like, this was in the 60s? Or, like, what? It looks because they do a pretty good job of keeping it up. And the way they use the materials obviously half the building is rock and concrete and it's not going anywhere, but they do keep it in pretty nice shape, and there's a lot of tour money flowing through there, I'm sure. But it's one of those places where it just was way ahead of its time as far as how it looks, how it works. I haven't been there in the worst times of the year, Phoenix or Scottsdale when it's 125 every day of the week. I don't know what it's like, but it's such an interesting complex in the way that it was kind of done over time, and to hear the stories about Wright. And it's interesting to hear the docents talk about the genius of Frank Lloyd Wright. And we've all been through architecture school, the royal we, and it's like, oh yeah, that was slave labor, right? For sure.
Yeah.
So definite other conversations to be had around this kind of thing as well. But the vision of that place carried out is pretty impactful.
So interesting. I have on my list a Wright complex as well, and that is Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida, which is the only Wright complex of buildings. And it's this small college in Lakeland, Florida that, is just it kind of goes off to, a very similar nature as this was later in his career, and not all of the buildings were finished, during his lifetime. And for somebody who did not grow up in Florida, although bad choice of construction material, because, in his concrete, he used, essentially local beach sand, which is high in salt content, and over time didn't quite understand the degradation of, the beach sand within the overall concrete composition. And I'm not saying that I know anybody who might have accidentally kicked through a wall.
Oh,
but it might have happened.
Okay.
Again, I don't know who that person is, and it won't stand up in a court of law. But the thing that I found amazing about Wright's ability, now, most of the time, a lot of like architects, American architects and stuff, they roll their eyes when they hear Wright. Some people love him, some people hate him and stuff. And yes, there is, quite a bit of genius or
and some people take it building by building.
And some people take it building by building when it comes to that. But
right.
The thing that I found really amazing about the place is that for somebody who didn't grow up in Florida, he really did actually kind of understand the Florida climate. And so the way that the buildings were collected, the way that they were arranged, the way that you had these, overhangs, the way that the overhangs were kind of open and then closed, and, and so they, kind of arranged themselves in some very different things. He actually understood the landscape that he was building in. I mean, so better, because I've never been to Taliesin West or Taliesin, that he very much seemed to be very in tune with with his built environment. Because, I know Florida architects because, I started practicing in Florida. I was raised there. So as I was practicing in Florida, I know of plenty of Florida architects who don't really fully understand the Florida climate and don't design very well around it. And then there's obviously plenty that do. But for somebody who, a Midwestern guy who at the end of his career was, out West and dealing with a complete, like with Taliesin West, is a completely different climate. Yeah, it's sunny, but it's arid and dry and everything else. And, Central Florida is hot and humid and high, sun, and it just like awful stifling. Because especially in like Central Florida, where you're far enough away from the coastline that, you're not getting those beach breezes and things like that. And so the air just feels oppressively humid and stagnant. For him to be able to create a space that basically the little bit of air movement that's going through it is almost creates kind of like this, because of the way he cut open like a canopy that connects one building to another. And it's, very much a Florida campus where, it's interconnected buildings with, canopies and things like that. And sure, the canopies are just a hair shorter than they should be, but I was very interested in the way that like the angles of the walls and the openings in the walls and things like that really captured Florida architecture better than a lot of Florida architects could do. Yeah, I've got a whole list of other Florida architects who were able to like kind of capture the essence of Florida in in kind of a more modern kind of approach with, Rudolph and Jean Leedy and all these other people who were part of the architectural movement, the Sarasota School of Architecture. But the Florida Southern College was just, another one of those like right complexes that he got it right.
Yeah, I mean, and there's other interesting projects in that region as well that I've been to on that same trip. I went to Paolo Soleri's Cosanti, his home in Scottsdale, and then to Arcosanti out in the community that he started, and just an amazing vision. It's talking about sustainable city of the future and wanting to like take it upon yourself to design that and build, at least begin to build that is an incredible vision that not too many people would think of, let alone attempt. And so I think that's what's so interesting about visiting that and his vision. Definitely have a Cosanti bell, a Soleri bell, I guess they're called, hanging out here in my backyard. It's just a great experience, again, to kind of go out there and see the vision and do the tour and meet the people who live there still on a daily basis, and kind of the journey that they're on and what they're searching for is kind of next level when it comes to, living a life a certain way. And when how architecture can kind of embody that whole way of thinking and that way of living is interesting. It's a lot different than just a building that is a museum that people visit, maybe once, or a building that people may go to work in and then go home from. But when it's all one community, one kind of architectural organism of sorts, that's a really interesting difference in the way that operates versus these other buildings that we're talking about.
So there's an interesting counterpoint to like the Archisante concept that Soleri did, and I'm going to go back to Wright for a second. But Wright had developed this kind of urban-suburban concept called Broadacre City.
Right.
It ended up only being like a subdivision in Mount Pleasant, New York. And so it's like 40 some odd houses that he did with like the plots and plans and everything else. And not every house in the historic district of Usonia was all done by Wright, but like the overall concept was, and it was built up.
I'm looking right now at the Wikipedia page. It says he designed 3 of the 47 homes himself.
Yeah, but he designed the actual like village, and then all these other architects kind of came in and filled them in, and but I mean it was kind of interesting to kind of like have that, and that one, and unfortunately I've never visited but want to visit in the pages of that one. I also have this interesting like little. I have a road trip of big famous architects on the East Coast that I want to do some of these days. That basically take me from at least where I'm at now in the DC area and kind of meander up the East Coast and pick out all of these different places, and then slowly but surely so I can like go all the way up into Massachusetts and go to some of these different places that like all of the masters that we learned about in architecture school, that whether or not they started like their the Bauhaus masters that had left the Bauhaus and came over to the U.S. and were practicing throughout the Northeast, and would love to go through and see the con buildings of the all of the remaining con buildings, all of the old Bauhaus masters and all these other ones, and all the different. I mean, I'd have to take a year off to like hit all of the Wright buildings, but
let's do it.
Okay,
we work hard enough. Let's do that. I got a lot of PTO saved up.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of road trips, my wife and I got to do. It's not really a road trip; it's more of a international road trip because we didn't drive there. But I started off by talking about Harpa, and then that was just the beginning of the Scandinavian trip. And I just wanted to touch on a few of the buildings that we experienced over there. The Capital A architecture, I already talked about the Woodland Cemetery, but some of the other ones are the Alto buildings. And we got to visit Alto's studio and Finlandia Hall. Mm-hmm. And I mean, just, the academic bookstore was there, just stumbled into that place, and it just incredible work. And getting to, hang out in Helsinki for a week and just try to see as much as we could. It's huge place, and his projects are pretty spread out, but there's a lot of them there, and you get to go to the Vitra Museum and see. He was one of those guys, kind of like John Lautner and other architects, who just designed everything. They designed the furniture, the faucets, the fixtures, everything about the projects, the handrails, the doorknobs. That was the thing I noticed, was the alto pull on the door to the academic bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I recognize that. Right. And it just stumbled on it. And we were walking through Helsinki, and there's just something really interesting about people who can't stop designing like that. And, Wright's falls in that category as well, right? It's like there's these little flourishes in unexpected places that you stumble upon, and they capture you. It's like the way that the handrail terminates, or the way that there's this impression in, this bas relief in the wall, or this special decorative steel thing that they do here and there. And I love that kind of stuff. And I think that's what makes it kind of architecture. And I think we miss out a lot on that in modern projects, especially the projects that we're doing where they're large, and it's hard to kind of, for us, a moment is a space. It's not a detailed little moment like the ones I'm talking about. And so that, to me, was what really stood out about Aalto's work. You can see it all over. You can see it in Finlandia Hall. You can see it in the tile work. You can see it in his home studio with the way that the structure is sitting just inside the wall. And it's just like this neat little moment, and the way the materials transition. And to me, that was something that I hadn't, I've read about it and I've seen it in books, but it wasn't until I actually got to experience it where it makes it feel like a home, or it makes it feel like there was some special amount of attention paid to these different little pieces. Like even in his office, in his studio, which is like, first he had his office in his home, and then he built a separate one, and then he continued to work out of his home personally. But even his studio is like that, with this giant curving wall with these little scallops underneath it that go out to this courtyard. It's just gorgeous play of light against the geometry of the building. And it's little things like that that really made it really special for me. So definitely on the short list, I think, are one or two of his projects.
Well, I'm sure that entire trip was filled with like things that could easily hit this list. Yeah,
totally. Actually, the one that is probably under high consideration for me, it's not an Aalto project. It was a Snøhetta project. It's the Oslo Opera House. And again, kind of an experiential piece of architecture where you get to walk all over that thing. And it's like this kind of iceberg sitting in the bay. It's just amazing piece of architecture. And the way that there are subtle details in the cladding that changes as you kind of walk all over this building, with these little kind of golf ball like dimples and the striations and the little curbs, and the way that the forms kind of undulate in a very kind of shattered glass like nature, and how it just kind of sits in the water and interfaces with the city. And then to go inside and have it be a completely warm, inviting interplay of materials, a lot of wood, but then the way the light comes in, it's just a really special building. So that one, I think, is probably towards the top of my list of buildings to talk about at a deeper level.
Yeah, and I mean, that one, just only being able to experience it from, magazines and online and stuff like that. The thing that I love about that is the Opera House is just the way that you can experience it. I mean, generally we don't design buildings that you can occupy the roofs, but, being able to like have the roofs kind of engage, all the way down to grade, and being able to... It's
just the fabric of the city. It's an extension of the fabric of the city, and anybody can walk up there.
Right.
Yeah, you don't have to buy a ticket to do that.
Yeah, so it's just...
super cool.
They become a public space that obviously purely intentional in this particular case, but, it's just those things that it's like, would we normally... I mean, in this country, we would, and I think we talked
Would you invite people to walk on your roof?
Yeah, we tend to, as I think we touched on this, it's, the liability factor, and it's just like, well, what if somebody fell off this roof? Now who's going to get sued for, kind of thing. And we don't necessarily, so we design around like 100% of public safety. So we don't really provide people with these weird opportunities. But could you just imagine if somebody, if you think about like the Cambridge 7 who had designed the National Aquarium in downtown Baltimore. And I can definitely see that particular building could have easily been, something that could have engaged people and the waterfront like this, where you still have, the actual building usage, but then you also have this purely engaging, thing that pulls people to the actual water's edge. And, you're engaging the building, you're engaging everything else. So like right now, there are plazas that bring you around the building and connect to, other little bits and pieces as you're walking through the inner harbor of Baltimore. But there's nothing that like is an architectural piece that like fully engages it. Everything basically is just this stationary item that sits within there and is never really fully engaging that. So things like this, people may look at it and they say, oh, this isn't really necessarily my architectural cup of tea. Need to look beyond just that idea of it being an object, but being a place.
I agree. I think that a lot of times projects like this get judged from afar, and it's not until you experience it. Disney Concert Hall falls well within the realm of this for me. It was one of those things where it's like, that's a one-trick pony. It doesn't seem to engage on a deeper level. It's all about just being this object and showing off. And then you go and you experience it and you walk all over it, kind of like the Oslo Opera House, and you get to experience in between the layers, and you get to go up and down the stairs, and you experience the gardens on the upper levels, and it is very successful in that way. When it captures your imagination and you're walking around with your eyes pointed up all the time, that there's something going on there that you've never seen before, you've never experienced before, and you're glad to have the opportunity to do it. And I think that's something that really separates architecture from buildings, right? Is it gives you the opportunity to experience things in new ways, and it really is about creating those experiences much deeper level than just setting your eyes upon something, right? It's not just how it looks.
So you had kind of texted me some time ago about the article about the Mike Maltzahn, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Michael Maltzahn.
Maltzahn, yeah. Okay. The design that they had done for the St. Petersburg Pier competition in St. Pete, Florida. And then I was like, too bad it didn't end up that way. It kind of basically ended up the way that the old building was, which is just a pavilion with a causeway that wraps around it. And the interesting thing about some of the solutions, Big had an entry in the competition. A bunch of like big name architects had, some really interesting concepts for that particular design competition, but none of that. Originally, his was selected for it, but then ultimately ended up in I could go through a whole political conversation about what had happened to it, because my friend of mine's firm was the local architect for that winning selection. And so then, they said, oh, well, we're going to open it up to local firms and all this other stuff. And so they ended up basically negating the referendum and all these other ones of like that particular winning one. But if you think about, like, I think we should put a link into the show notes about this, because, and I look more at like, the Oslo Opera House and the way that it engages the water as well as the waterfront, and looks back at the city, looks out away from the city. And it's just all these different undulating planes that kind of give you the opportunity to engage the city and the water and everything else in completely different ways than you would normally be if you were just walking on a flat, causeway, around the building. And his design actually captured that and engaged it in a way that made it feel more like it should be there than, and it even had like little tunnels that you would like go underwater. You'd be able to engage underwater and, above water and all this other stuff. And it was just this really amazing concept that, unfortunately people started to see the dollar signs. but I don't think they really started to see like what the benefit of like a piece of architecture like that would have done for the city that has seen, some good economic times and some bad economic times, and has been trying to ride through them and recreate itself over and over again. And, things like that would have definitely been a very similar kind of experience as to what like the Oslo Opera House is capturing, where it completely engages the city in a multitude of different ways and is always changing depending on where you're at and, what time of year and all of these other things. And you see these successes like this one, and then you see these, it could have been this. And then you get that kind of stuff. Because, you think about it. I was really impressed with the grandeur of the Milwaukee Museum of Art edition. I was also actually pretty impressed with the old kind of like brutalist original building that kind of sat up on a perch above the city. It was one of the more delicate brutalist buildings I've ever seen, because it was still very heavy, but it still seemed very light and kind of was just like the way that it engages the ground. But the spaces that are created beyond the gimmicky architecture of like the lifting sails and all of this other stuff. But the unfortunate thing about it is that if you go to like the bow side of it or the front side of it, where you really, want to engage the way that the building sees, how you see the building kind of interplay with the city, it is again a building that's just perched on a flat piece of causeway that, you just kind of, you walk around the building and it sits completely different than I'm just going to say, it sits on Lake Michigan. So I would say that the east side and the west side being the city side, is far more successful because of the way that it interplays with the landscape, the way that it creates all of these different spaces, and that it's just a part of an ensemble of buildings and landscape. Whereas the more unsuccessful side is just the side that is looking towards the city, that didn't kind of capture the kind of the activity that you want on the lake edge, like the Oslo Opera House. I don't know. It was a very long-winded kind of like walking around, basically saying that I really dig, at first glance. Yeah, I remember when, I saw the Opera House in the magazines. I was like, and kind of like shrugged my shoulders a little bit. But then as I started to see it through a different lens and to really understand kind of everything that you had explained from being there, what it actually does, and then you really start to look at that in that prism, you're like, yes, this is, I get it. It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, and it's one of those places where you're getting as much out of it as everybody else. You can look around and see what other people are experiencing, and it's a great place to watch people interact with architecture and learn a little bit about how people interact with architecture, especially a different kind of architecture, and kind of the surprise and delight that they're experiencing. In this case, is what I experienced from just watching them, and going up and going down and watching kids play on it and look at themselves in the reflection of the glass, and while they're walking up this kind of inclination up to the roof, it's really neat to see how other people interact with it, even when you're kind of absorbed in your own experience. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot to unpack when you go visit a place like that. So I can see the end in sight here. I don't know if you can. I'll talk about one that I've been to more recently that has been a huge impact on my academic experience, my professional experience, and it's the Salk down in La Jolla. And recently got to go on a tour of that, and wow, like this one is probably really high on the list of one worth talking about as far as a deep dive. But I don't want to get too deep into it here, but it's everything that you've ever heard about it and more. It's especially when you get to go on a real tour of it and get into the spaces that if you just go there and you're not signed up for a tour, you can't even get in the courtyard. You could just walk around the outside. Then the next layer is to get into the courtyard and kind of approach the building how it was designed to be approached. and then there's actually getting into the spaces. And there's so many layers. And I think some of the most interesting things that I'll just kind of throw out there to kind of tease this as a potential is there's more volume of air in the complex than there is of concrete. And I don't think we think about buildings like that, especially when you look at how dense this complex is and how it's a multi-use complex, right? It's a live-work arrangement. And then there's this kind of outdoor space that everybody shares. And then the other thing was just Khan's kind of collaboration with Salk and how important Salk was to the design of this place. It wasn't just the lone genius, Louis Kahn, drawing all the lines. It was, they went through a pretty rigorous process, had this whole thing designed, and then Salk got on a plane the day that it was going to be submitted, or, the deadline or whatever, and was basically start over. Want to change everything. To create a culture. Instead of just creating a monument, he wanted to create a scientific culture. And I think that is super interesting aspect of it. And then finally, just the collaboration that Salk had with Barragan, pulling Barragan in to talk about landscape. He had been really impressed with Barragan's use of landscape. And I think Barragan kind of threw him for a loop and did something unexpected and said, instead of filling this courtyard with trees like Khan originally wanted to, kind of creating this alley of trees, he said, make this a facade for the sky. And I thought, what a perspective to have. They didn't have Google Earth. They didn't have the ability that we have now to look at every part of the building, not only as architects, but as bystanders, of people who can just pull up satellite imagery on a whim on their phone. To think about it back then like that, I think is just truly amazing. So a little teaser there of potential for talking about the Salk, but definitely really high on the list of projects. And I would love to see more of his work. I would love to get to the East Coast and see more of his work. I would love to go to India and see more of his work. I would love to get as much Louis Kahn as I could.
Have you been to Exeter Library?
No.
We got to...
There's a great short film online about it. It's mostly CGI, I think, but man, it's amazing. It's just a beautiful work of art. It really got me wanting to go there.
This is just a complete side note because I've never been there, and I've kind of bashed Calatrava for two different projects. A little bit, not excessively. I mean, yeah, the Westfield Mall, whatever. But I really actually want to see, and this is just a bucket list one, I'd love to go to Valencia, Spain, and see the City of Arts and Sciences. Because every image that I see of it is just this amazing kind of interplay between a very, very formal landscape intervention and the building interventions. And it's just, you see how all these buildings and how they're positioned on the reflecting, pool. And, they just kind of you have this negative of the building, from, the reflection down in the water. And they look pretty amazing. I mean, I was kind of giving a little bit of grief to him, but, he's still pretty damned amazing architect. But come on, man, check your welds.
You wouldn't be talking about the Oculus, would you?
No, not at all.
All right. Got anything else on your list?
I'm never going to unsee those things.
Haunting welds. Yeah.
I mean,
let's finish it up. Let's wrap it up. Let's do one more each.
The Barnes Museum in Philadelphia. It's a pretty amazing. So if anybody knows the story behind the original Barnes Museum, and if you look up the documentary the Art of the Steel, I think that's what it's called. Yeah, which is about the Barnes collection and how apparently Alfred Barnes wasn't too ready for his passing when and what happens to all of his art collection and all of that other stuff. So there was a big fight for the collection to be moved into the city of Philadelphia from Marion, if I'm remembering the movie correctly, from Marion, Pennsylvania, which was a suburb of the city, And it was in this, really nice, kind of classical building. And then they, basically moved it in, ultimately it was, taken over by, I believe, the state or the city, and then moved into the city. And its new home is basically designed on Museum Row, this big, huge, green swath that cuts all the way through and kind of terminates at the big Philadelphia Art Museum at the very end with the Rocky statue and all that other stuff. But it's you and I were there during the AIA convention together, and we went there before we actually went into the building because we were trying to see it, and then it's closed.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. And we walked around it and were able to kind of like engage the building and the landscape and all of that other stuff. And it's such a beautiful building done by Todd Williams, Billy Chen, right?
Yep.
And it's just this absolutely beautiful building, and tectonically and the way that it it's like this big kind of like heavy box that engages the landscape so delicately. And the land, it's not a very big plot of land beyond the actual museum, but the way that they engage the site is pretty nice. I'm kind of hoping to go back through, a few more times throughout my lifetime to just see how the area around it that is developing around there, and kind of like revitalizing really kind of engages with it, and how that evolves, because it's interesting that it's got almost two contexts. It's got, the context that faces out towards the big kind of, green parkway. Then it kind of faces another way more towards the, kind of like residential area. But what's interesting, kind of breaks down the scale between the two, the side towards the museums and in the parkway or the park and everything else are very large and kind of commanding of facade. And then the other one almost kind of breaks down, between like the little courtyard and the small spaces and the wall between it and the everything else. It kind of breaks the scale down so it fits a little bit better with the neighbors that it sits in.
Yeah, half that building floats.
Yeah.
Too.
Oh, yeah.
That's impressive. And the section through that building, the way that they bring light in.
Oh, my God, yes.
Is impressive. So, yeah, maybe we'll save that one. Let's talk more about that one on another episode.
Yeah, we can.
Agreed. Like that one is total capital A architecture. Billy Chen, Todd Williams are heroes of mine for sure. And I think, I visited down here in La Jolla near the Salk is a building or a little complex that they did called the Neurosciences Institute. And it's like kind of what I was talking about earlier, where there's these little flourishes here and there, and you find these bas-relief impressions in the concrete, and you find what they did with the handrail, and you see what they did with holding these panels just off, making these travertine panels float. Like there's just incredible detailing in their projects. Incredible. I think that's what I love most about the barns was the architecture, even more than the art that was on display, and how it is a nice subtle backdrop, but it isn't it's a thing of beauty all on its own. Like it's a really well balanced project. It's an incredible project. So, yeah. So, all right. So last one on my list, I'll finish up with this one, is the project I went to, I guess it was about a year ago, the Seattle Public Library. And I haven't been to many OMA buildings, but man, what an experience. Again, like this is from the outside, it just kind of looks like this iceberg kind of thing that's obviously it's all about the experience on the inside, and they kind of shrink wrapped that experience with this curtain wall. And the way that you get to experience that and what they did, what they pulled off with the levels and the way that you participate in space and the way that you kind of in and out and up and down and around, and there's so much surprise in that building. And I think, we've talked before about creating those moments and those experiences. This thing is an experience after the next. It's just like the Guggenheim. I go to the top and then work your way down and take as long as you can to get down, because there's so many things to experience. And it's a public building. It's for the public. The public uses the heck out of that building. There's so much program smashed in there that it's a huge service to the public, but it's also a great experience, and it's not just shelves with books on it, right? Like it's very much capital A architecture. And I was really surprised because from the outside, it wasn't something that I was excited about seeing. And I had heard about people's experience, and I've heard Joshua Prince Rasmus talk about, the little balcony that he designed to propose to his wife on when he was working at OMA. And there's a lot of neat little things like that, but it's not until you actually get there and you actually experience it that it really is something worth seeing and talking about. So that one I think is also on the short list of potentials to do a deeper dive on. So, have you ever been there?
No, and in fact, actually, that is one of the cities that I have yet to travel to, and so
yeah, this was my first time.
And I'd really be interested in hearing it because I got to tell you, of all of the Starchitects, OMA is usually on a list of take it or leave it kind of ones. Because I guess there are such a weird quirkiness to all of their work that it seems so, I don't know, this is the one where, the contextualist in me always kind of shudders when I see their work because it basically says, piss on everything else. This is, what we're going to do regardless of the context around it. But from everything that I've ever heard, it is the interior space that really is the space that, you really need to experience and feel before you kind of judge. And, like you, I've never been in an OMA building. And so I always like to I have this initial reaction from just what I see in magazines and stuff like that. And always reserve final true judgment until I actually am physically able to go and see a space, because I don't ever want to because trust me, everybody knows what we all go through when we're, doing some of these things, and the mind of, their particular design versus, my sensibilities of design might be two completely different things. And that one Galleria, and I'm not even going to bother to try to, pronounce the name of the thing, but I'm looking at their website right now, Gaio. Anyway, it is a very interesting building, and I'm going to leave it at that. But I'm pretty sure that interior-wise, it's pretty damned amazing. But exterior-wise, you're like, huh, okay.
Well, they definitely believe in the big idea, and they do create really interesting experiences and kind of unconventional solutions. And I think that's exactly what the Seattle Public Library embodies, and that the city was, able to pull it off is incredible. And it is from my standpoint, and again, first time to Seattle, there's lots to talk about as far as Seattle goes and Seattle architecture goes. That one really stood out. There was the Pop MoMA Museum, there was the Space Needle, there's all kinds of stuff that you could talk about. There's the Amazon crap that's going on downtown, the spheres and stuff. But really, that as a service to the public is an incredible piece of architecture. It is absolutely incredible. So say what you will about it, and OMA's work at large, but it was a fantastic experience. So again, I think it's probably worth being on the short list.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I'd really love to kind of hear about it, because impressions are one thing, but experience is totally, the real issue.
Were you at the Monterey Design Conference when their New York director spoke?
Yes.
That was a great lecture.
It was.
And that's what really kind of opened my eyes to OMA in a broader sense, and just kind of the thinking behind the work. And I loved how he had a lot of humor in his lecture. I think we talked about it on one of the episodes when we talked about the Monterey Design Conference. But they didn't take themselves too seriously. They're total architects, and they're total black cape wearing architects, right? But they seem to be having a lot of fun. And I'm sure it's, there's a lot going on there.
And maybe that's
I don't know
too. It's a little bit of jealousy. They're having fun. Damn.
Anyway,
architecture's not fun.
I think we've gone on long enough. We've given people so many things to look up and think about. Again, we'll have all of these links in the show notes for this episode so that you can see all the things that we're talking about. Obviously, an audio podcast about architecture is a little bit of a a slippery thing it's hard to talk about all these things that we should be looking at and experiencing.
Right.
But in the pandemic times when we can't go visit architecture, let's talk about visiting architecture, right? What makes sense to me.
And, what's interesting about it is think about these in the context of like, what do you miss about physically visiting architecture, like architecture, capital A architecture or whatever, from being in the quarantine thing, and what building would you want to visit as the first building, out of quarantine that you're able to go and visit? And we'll talk a little bit further on which one mine's going to be.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to the next episode, recording that with you and talking about it, and I hope everybody else is too. So all the links for this episode are going to be in the show notes for every building or place that we talked about, but we're also going to include a special photo gallery from Cormac's and my travel to these different places for as many as we can, and just the good stuff, right? We're not going to just be all-encompassing, but let's throw some images into a gallery for the show notes to this page. So something probably worth saying too is, if you're listening to this in your podcast player, we'll have a link in the show notes to this show notes page, but also if you subscribe to our mailing list, you will get the show notes emailed to you. That's all we do with that mailing list. If you go to archispeakpodcast.com and you fill out the little information on the right-hand side of the page, that's just so that you get the show notes emailed to you each time an episode gets posted, and that link will take you directly, and you can look at the gallery from the photography from our travels in there. Sound good?
Don't judge mine.
Don't judge me. They're informational. They're not all art. All right, that might be all for this episode, but maybe listen to the end just in case. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. See all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what we're doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and don't forget to share it with your friends. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at archispeakpodcast.com, where you can find our entire catalog of shows. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.
This is what you get. This is what you get. This is a schedule. This is a set. It's unpredictable as you forget. If you blow, you can bet. I know. This is what you get. This is a schedule. This is a set. It's unpredictable as you forget. If you blow, you can bet. I know. You forget. If you blow, you can bet. I know. This is what you get.